Okay, so now that we've made those changes to our create account page, what you might have noticed is that when we walked through that flow and actually created a user, we got this error in the console. Okay, at least if yours ran anything like mine did, you would have got this error that said cannot read property notes of null, blah blah blah, and that's coming from the list notes route, as we can see. So if we open up that file, which I have right here, what we're going to see is that this error is coming from this user.notes.map blah blah blah. So user is actually null in this case, and the reason for this is actually quite subtle. It's caused by a sort of race condition. Okay, so in other words, when the user here creates an account on our front end, what that front end is going to do is it's first going to create an account over here on Firebase auth. Okay. And only once it's done with that, and actually logging the user out too, of course, is it actually going to make a request to the server to create a new user, right? That's going to be this post/users route that we created earlier for creating a new user and inserting that data. Now, at that same point in time, remember, we've already logged the user in by calling that create user with email and password function. So for a very brief point in time, almost unnoticeable, the user is actually redirected to the notes page in our application, which tries to load those notes. Okay, now the problem with this, I'm just going to draw the server here like that. The problem with this is that at this point in time, chances are that this post users thing has not actually completed. So there is currently no user in the database with that user's data. Right, so what's happening, that's the error we're getting, is it's saying that this user here is null because there is currently no user with that user ID in the database. It hasn't been created yet by the front end. Now, more often than not, and this is very much the case with our situation here, more often than not, these kinds of bugs are caused when we haven't really thought out very well the architecture of a certain situation, right? And in particular, what I'm talking about is that we really shouldn't be signing the user out and creating the user account here on our create account page, right? That's not really the best way to go about it, since it puts too much of the logic in the front end, and there's a lot of side effects that happen by prematurely logging in the user, as we just saw with the error that we got in the console. So in order to remove this error and simplify our flow a little bit, what we're going to do instead, and here, let me just scroll down so that I have a nice big black screen here to draw on. What we're going to do instead is we're not going to call the create user with email and password thing on the front end. We're instead going to simply have our front end make a request. The only thing it's going to do is make a request to the server's /users route to create a new user. All right, and inside this route, we're going to use Firebase admin to actually create the user in Firebase. All right, so the benefits of this are that the user won't be logged in briefly on the front end. All we're going to do is just redirect them to the please verify email page, and we won't have to worry about signing them out. This post users endpoint will take care of everything. Okay, so here's what that's going to look like. Essentially, we're just going to change our create account function that we're calling here. We're going to remove create user with email and password. Okay, we're just going to get rid of that altogether. We're going to remove sign out. We're going to remove this token thing. We're going to leave axios.post, but we're not going to be able to send along the user's token with this because the user hasn't actually been created yet. What we're going to send along instead, okay, we're just going to remove these headers here. What we're going to send along instead is going to be the user's email and password that they just entered into the inputs, okay? So we're saying axios.post, we're sending that to users, we're sending the email and password. So in this endpoint now, which we can open here, we're going to go to create user route. Inside this endpoint, we're going to have to make several changes, okay? Now, the first change is that we're not going to have access to this auth user thing because the user hasn't even been created yet. So we're going to have to remove that, and we're also going to have to remove the middleware here, which is trying to verify the auth token. As we just saw, we're not going to have an auth token because, once again, the user doesn't exist yet. So let's delete that as well. And the next thing that we're going to do here is get the email and password that the user just entered. So we'll say const email and password equals request.body. And then we're going to do things a little bit backwards from what we did before, right? Previously, we were trying to create a user first on the front end, and then we were sending that user's token to the back end. And that had the potential to cause some nasty conflicts here with this existing user thing if, for some reason, that email wasn't already in Firebase auth and was already in our database, right? This would basically send back a 409 conflict thing in that case, and there wouldn't really be a whole lot that the user could do about it because they wouldn't have the ability to delete their account. So anyway, what I'm saying with all of this is that before we even try and create a user with this email and password, we're going to check if there's already a user with that email, right? So we already have the logic for this, okay? All we have to do here is instead of saying auth_user.email, which doesn't exist, we're just going to say email, right? So we're finding if a user is already in our database with that email address. And if there is, we're sending back a 409, which will be interpreted to mean that that user already exists. And after that, here is where we want to actually create that new user in Firebase auth using Firebase admin. Okay, so the function here for Firebase admin is a little bit different. Here's what it's going to look like. We're going to get rid of verify auth token because we don't need it. And instead, we're going to import all as admin from Firebase admin. And going back down here, we're going to say const result equals await admin.auth.create user. Okay, so create user is the name of the function on Firebase admin. The reason they didn't call it create user with email and password is because since this is the admin package, it gives us a little more leeway with what we're allowed to do here. So we're going to say await admin.auth.create user. And what we do here is we pass some data in the form of an object to create user containing things like the user's email, the user's password, etc. And we can also include things like their display name and whatnot that will be added to Firebase auth's data. So for now, though, we're just going to have email, and that's going to, of course, be email. We're going to have password as well, which will, of course, be the password that we got up here from the body. And one last thing, we're going to say email verified, and we're going to explicitly set that to false here. And this right here is how we're going to keep track of whether or not a user has already verified their email. All right, we'll see how that actually works a little later on. But basically, this is now going to contain the user that we just created. So actually, instead of result, as we did on the front end, we can say const user. And then what we can do is instead of saying auth_user.uid here, we're just going to say user.uid. Email, we're just going to set that to the email that the user entered. And we don't have to store the password because that's taken care of by Firebase auth for us. In fact, we should not store the password because we don't yet know all of the security practices that are involved in doing so. So we're just going to store the ID that we're getting from Firebase, just as we did before, the email that the user entered, and we're going to initialize notes as an empty array. Okay, and then we're getting the result back from the database after inserting it, and we're sending the new user data back to the user with an inserted ID. We're actually not going to want to do this anymore. We're just going to say response.status 200, and actually that should be send status 200. Right, we're just telling the client side, yep, everything went well. Send the user to the page, tell them they need to verify their email. That's the next step. Okay, so we can actually remove this const result thing. And that's really all we need to do for our create user route. So let's give this thing a try now, shall we? Our create account page, everything should work on there. We might have to make one or two little changes, but everything else for the most part should be in place. So first of all, let's just make sure that everything is working. Uh-oh, it looks like we're getting an error of some kind. And the reason that this is happening is because we didn't account for the fact that middleware could be an empty array, right? So when we deleted that, basically in our server.js file, when we say ..root.middleware, this here could be null. And as a matter of fact, it looks like my IDE already underlined this for me, saying maybe that could be a problem. So all we're going to do here is just say route middleware or empty array, just in case there is no middleware to speak of. All right, so let's open up our terminal now, and we should see server is listening on port 8080, right? Nothing went wrong, and our front end should be running well as well. So let's try creating an account one more time. What we're going to do, we're going to say asdf2@gmail.com. And by the way, ASDF is just the letters that fall under my fingers first when I just type random letters. That's the only reason why I'm using that. Hopefully it doesn't stand for anything in your line of work or in your friend group. All right, so let's put in some passwords here. We're going to re-enter it, and then we're going to click on Create Account. And we should see this Thanks for Signing Up page now. And if we go back and check our MongoDB, well, first of all, notice that there is no error now in the server. Everything looks like it was good. In MongoDB, we should now be able to see that there's a new user called asdf2@gmail.com. You can find that by doing db.users.find.pretty. And sure enough, we see that this new user has been inserted into the database. And we can also see if we go to the Firebase console and go to authentication and users that ASDF and ASDF2, this one most importantly, is stored in there. And just to do a quick double check that this user ID here matches the one that was inserted. Yep, it looks like 5IZ. Their I's there don't look any different than the lowercase L's. But anyway, that's a job for the Google typographers. So essentially what we've done here is rewritten our create account flow entirely so that the front end just makes a single request to the back end. The back end actually takes care of creating a new user, and then it just says to the front end, cool, everything's good, and the front end tells the user, go verify your email, and the user is not logged in at any point in that entire flow. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.